Zimbabwe's re-engagement drive with the international community has dominated the national economic dialogue under the new administration. The country has opened new diplomatic avenues underpinned by mutual respect, shared principles, and common values. However, despite the global outreach and policy thrust on the reform agenda that seeks to give impetus to the Zimbabwe is open for business mantra, sanctions remain the elephant in the room. For thousands of years, economic sanctions have been used as a tool of economic statecraft.
The sanctions against Zimbabwe came in two forms. The Zidera Act, which was an American congressional legislation punishing the Zimbabwean economy so that it could swoon and then deliver regime change, because the West were simply not happy with the government of Zimbabwe, which had been an issue of the National Liberation Movement from the 1970s. The other sanctions were from the EU. These two components, the United States and the EU, they were our traditional major trading partners. By lack of access to markets from those two regional economic blocks, then you are bound to swoon, which was the intention of sanctions. You've got to remember Chester Crocker says that we must make the Zimbabwe economy scream.
Industrialization is necessary for African countries to transform their economies. Following the imposition of illegal economic sanctions on the country, industrial growth was affected.
Sanctions have made it near impossible for Zimbabwe to participate, to be involved on the global economic arena. Industry was brought to its knees because of sanctions.
We were facing some challenges as an economy then, but I think the sanctions worsened our situation. Companies found it difficult to recapitalize their businesses because they could not access cheap lines of credit. But even at operational level, trading level, getting the right working capital to do business in the normal way proved to be difficult.
It's a very, very emotional, a very sentimental subject, the issue of sanctions. But a number of scholars, even locally, have also done a bit of analysis to find out the real cost of sanctions. And I think there's now a bit of consensus in terms of the numbers that are coming out, that yes, I think they have had a negative effect in terms of, number one, increasing the risk premium that is associated with Zimbabwe as an investment destination. And it also makes it difficult for borrowers in Zimbabwe to be able to access not just government, but even private sector borrowers.
Prior to the imposition of sanctions, Zimbabwe used to access sources of external finance from international financial institutions such as the African Development Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. However, with sanctions, the country's borrowing capacity was crippled.
Access to capital has been quite impossible for the Zimbabwean society, for the Zimbabwean economy. And there is no single country. You take this, what could be perceived as the biggest economy worldwide, I mean America, they're one of the biggest debtors too. There is no single economy that can stand on its own and in isolation of the others. It is worse with the growing economies, with the developing economies, such as Zimbabwe.
The negative perception that comes with sanctions has impacted on foreign direct investment inflows as international investors tend to shy away from economies that are perceived as risky.
Investors in general would not want to do business in an environment that is sanctioned, whether it's targeted sanctions, whether it's an embargo, whatever. I think it makes it difficult for investors to invest in Zimbabwe, and obviously then it also affects competitiveness. It affects even when you look at the numbers, for example, with respect to FDI. we have seen a downward spiral.
Our banking sector was affected. Some of the players in that sector directly. The state that we find our industry in, where capacity utilization is around the 30%. In normal economies that are working well, that can trade freely, capacity utilization should be above 80, 90%, but we find ourselves, playing in the 30s, 40s, which really, it is testimony to the impact of sanctions.
Big companies such as the Zimbabwe Iron and Steel Company ZISCO, Zimbabwe Glass, and many others were negatively affected, resulting in some people being rendered jobless.
If investments are not thriving in Zimbabwe, it affects employment creation. If investors are not coming, then it means there's no employment creation. If the cost of doing business is going up, it means the cost of accessing basic services, basic goods and services will also go up. So I think the implication cumulatively, I think it's quite direct through increase in the cost of production, increase in the cost of accessing services, increase even in the cost of trading. Actually, also becomes also constrained and quite expensive.
Found that the markets out there are restricted. Markets to Europe, markets to the States. Some countries enjoy favorable trading conditions under the AGOA Act, which we can't do.
As the new administration continues to lobby for the removal of the illegal sanctions, the country is opening new diplomatic avenues, underpinned by mutual respect, shared principles, and common values. The coming in of the new dispensation has led to the growth in exports. There has been an intensification of trade with other countries and several foreign markets.
We have managed to remain resilient as a country. If I can tell you right now, if you look at our export statistics, January to August 2020, compared with January to August 2019, our exports have gone up by 4.9%. And this is against a backdrop where analysts were saying growth was going to remain in the negative. So this also shows resilience. But furthermore, if you look at the analysis, and especially focusing on the manufacturing sector, the biggest movers has been the processed foods, which during the same period, exports have grown by more than 10%. And for us, I think one key country that stuck out from the region, SADC, was Botswana, where exports grew from around 20 million in 2017. Now in 2020, we're exporting more than 40 million, so that's more than 100%.
The Zimbabwe National Industrial Policy is one of the policies launched by President Emmerson Mnangagwa's government to help transform the economy. The policy seeks to facilitate and promote the development of sustainable, innovative, inclusive and globally competitive industrial enterprises for economic growth.
Under the Second Republic, we will not perpetuate the culture of sundry importation of products which can be produced locally. Strategies for the resuscitation and growth of the country's industrial base through the Industrial Development Fund and the stimulus package targeting companies affected by the COVID-19 pandemic have been adopted. Fiscal incentives are also being availed to companies such as VAT deferment on the importation of capital equipment, exemption of customs duty payments, and the granting of national project status, among others.
Furthermore, robust fiscal and monetary interventions to preserve the value and credibility of the Zimbabwean currency continue to be implemented.
And the Second Republic has moved swiftly to reverse that anti-business, anti-capital outlook. That's why we are doing so well. We had the major changes in the monetary front, the closing of the stock exchange to stop subversion of the national currency by leading corporate players abusing the stock exchange. We had also the wild west behavior of the mobile money exchanges, which had become de facto central bank in their own right. All this has been shattered by the president, and he has now put discipline in the economy, and he then went further to introduce the auction of the currency. And this has done magic in the last 16 weeks. We have now a currency which is steadying, and the major result of it is that I'm getting news now from some of the major companies which had suffered historically. They are saying September has been their best month ever.
Zimbabwe will not be deterred by the illegal economic sanctions and will not continue to mourn over them, but will instead maximize exploitation of its vast natural resources for economic prosperity.
We can still do things in spite of the sanctions. I think the better. There are opportunities, for instance, with the COVID pandemic. We have seen huge developments in the ICT sector where you can run businesses from anywhere in the world, provide services on a world scale. And with the advantage that we have that our citizens have been educated, highly educated, not only in Zimbabwe but across the world, there are opportunities to actually set up world-scale, businesses in the ICT sector based here, where it may not matter that the country itself is under sanctions. In the medical field, a lot of our citizens are operating in the best hospitals in the world. And if we set the right conditions for them to come and set up here, we could actually set up world-class facilities that can service the rest of the world, that is not necessarily putting sanctions on us. From a manufacturing point of view, we can start by manufacturing for ourselves, import substitute, and then eventually develop to start exporting to the rest of the world.
There are some things that we must do as a country to bust these sanctions. I think there's a lot that must be done, and that can be done to bust this. For example, through import substitution industrialization. And I'm happy that that's the policy direction in which government is trying now to go to implement import substitution as a way of dealing with the adverse implications of sanctions. And we've seen it in a number of countries. We have seen it in Cuba, for example. Cuba is a very good example of a country that's been able to successfully bust sanctions. In fact, the Cuban economy now, it's a very strong economy, quite industrialized. They've been able to build a strong social welfare state in spite of the U.S. embargo that has actually been there for more than 50 years. So I think I'm happy that at least government is trying to do that as well. So it's really a lesson and a wake-up call for Zimbabweans that in spite of these measures, we can actually prosper if we are united, if we have the will and the commitment to prosper. So I think that's the positive news coming from experience of countries that have been imposed with sanctions, that we can, if we are united, if we have a common vision, a common understanding, we can actually prosper in spite of these sanctions.
It will be very, very important that a national position, a national vision, a national strategy, a national focus of how we can counter sanctions, of how we can continue to rebut, to work against sanctions, will be very, very important, of how we can make do with sanctions. These sanctions will require us to nationally converge. Family Zimbabwe must work together against these sanctions. The whole crusade of productivity is critical. The whole crusade of bringing our young people into a national arena, into a space where they can begin to exploit our resources.
For almost a decade, Zimbabwe had to fight a lone battle to have the illegal sanctions removed. But in a new development, the 39th SADC Summit of Heads of State and Government unanimously agreed to lobby for the unconditional lifting of the illegal sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe.
This brotherly and sisterly country has been on sanctions for a long time. These sanctions have not only affected the people of Zimbabwe and their government, but our entire region. It is like a human body. When you chop one of its parts, it affects the whole body. Therefore, I would like to seize this opportunity to argue the international community to lift up sanctions it imposed on Zimbabwe.
I wish to make a special appeal for an end to the economic and commercial, as well as financial embargo against Cuba, sanctions against Zimbabwe and Sudan. The United Nations provides us a platform to resolve age-old differences and unburden ourselves of these antiquated conflicts.
More and more people globally are realizing that the sanctions were illegal. They were not only illegal, but they were heinous, and they were meant to destroy a population, a part of humanity. And there's a revulsion against those sanctions now globally. Nobody supported them in the United Nations. China and Russia actually vetoed them. South Africa, our neighbor, our big neighbor, took the lead in organizing the veto against those sanctions in 2002 and also in 2008.
The lifting of the sanctions, coupled with many initiatives being implemented in the new dispensation, will certainly put Zimbabwe on the right path towards achieving Vision 2030.
Samanya kunoshipisa nyika yedu kunze. Samanya kunokumbira masanction.